So, getting into the biblical model, what does the text actually say? And I'll be particularly talking about lending, interest, and other aspects of finance. I won't be talking that much about money in general. There's huge amounts of teaching in the New Testament about mammon and so on. You can find that out in other papers I've written. So, just to note that first, interest-free lending is commended very strongly. You need to look at a couple of those references about the promises of blessing for those who lend interest-free. It is commanded in the Old Testament law to the poor. So in particular in Exodus and Leviticus, the prohibition of interest is couched in terms of lending to the poor. In Deuteronomy 15, there are laws about debt cancellation, particularly debts that have been given to the poor. They may have then needed to come into debt servitude, and then those debts are to be cancelled, those servants to be released. So on the one hand, strong encouragement to those who have spare money to lend it interest-free. This is a great thing. However, for those who are borrowing, there is a very strong moral imperative to repay. So in Psalms, it says, it is the wicked who borrow and don't repay. And Paul emphasizes that again in Romans 13. And the law gives quite detailed instructions about you can take security if you're a lender. You can take collateral against somebody's cloak or their millstone or whatever they can pledge against the loan. So there's protections to those who are lending to make sure if they want to, they can get their money back. However, that said, there is a clear intention for freedom from debt in the system. Perhaps the key verse in the Old Testament on all of this, and this is making a big impact now in American churches, is Proverbs 22:7. The rich rule over the poor, and the borrower is slave of the lender. Effectively, debt is slavery. You may not be the legal slave or servant of somebody, but Proverbs is saying if you're in debt, you've given a promise. You've pledged your future income. And therefore you've got an obligation. And you are effectively, you've given away your financial independence and your freedom. So there's no question of, oh, it's sinful to borrow. That's not the case. As we've seen, people may need to borrow and interest-free lending is encouraged. But freedom from debt is a desirable outcome. And that was then institutionalized every 7 years. Debts were cancelled within Israel. Debt slaves were released. And this was set up so that every time you lent, you knew that if there was a year of debt cancellation coming up, you were going to have to relieve it then. And then 7 times 7 years, every jubilee, 49 years, you had the debt cancellation of debt cancellations. You had both the coincidence of monetary debts being cancelled, but then everyone's mortgages, the leaseholds on land, on their familial land, was cancelled or came to an end, and they could go back to their property if they'd had to leave it and mortgage it. Then also Leviticus 25 sets out a very important concept of the kinsman redeemer. That is, that if you became poor, indebted yourself, the most responsible close male relative effectively was then responsible to buy you out of debt, release the mortgage on your property or whatever. And so as we see in Ruth, where the Boaz acts as the kinsman redeemer to buy the property back for Naomi and Ruth, that is that institution being worked out. So you have those points about debt. Then this is sort of complemented by the sort of assumption of debt-free money. Now this is a strange concept for us because, of course, all the money we use now is a debt of either a government, central bank, or of a bank. So we exchange checks, credit card, tickets, cash, and those are all in some way debts. But it wasn't originally like that, and monetary forms tended to be of real things, tended to be commodities, silver or gold. And so in Old Testament times you have the presumption of a few prices being set out in terms of silver. But there's no command that this is how it must be done. So there's no sort of verse that says Israel must have metallic money, gold, the gold standard or whatever. But it's worth noting that if you check a few of the prices that you get in the Old Testament that you can track, so the piece of land, interestingly, that Jeremiah buys outside Jerusalem is, I think, the same piece of land that Judas, or he bought with the Judas 30 pieces of silver. And there's a couple of prices of slaves that you can find in the Old Testament. There is roughly stability of prices across centuries. So this is a system, as we found in the UK under the gold standard from around 1600 to about the First World War. There is rough stability of prices over centuries. So the price of bread in 1913 in terms of pence in the UK was roughly the same as it was in the mid-1600s because of the gold standard. Prices went up and down. You could have inflation 10% in a boom time, but it came down later. So I'm going to stop there. I haven't properly addressed the foreigner issue, we can come back to that, but we'll take a few questions now.